Imagine waking up on a Sunday morning, so calm it feels almost staged, blue sky, warm light, routine drifting through the base like nothing in the world could possibly be urgent. And then, without warning, the horizon starts screaming. Not metaphorically, literally. Engines, sirens, explosions, fire on water, metal tearing like paper, men sprinting barefoot, half-dressed, eyes wide, still trying to understand whether they're dreaming. In seconds, Pearl Harbor stopped being a place and became a signal flare for the entire 20th century. America has been hit, and America is now awake. The shock wasn't just physical destruction. It was psychological violation. It was the feeling that the United States, protected by oceans, insulated by distance, had been reached, touched, humiliated. And once that happens, once a nation feels its pride punched in public, the response stops being political and becomes primal. Pearl Harbor is usually framed as the moment the United States entered World War II. That's true, but it's also incomplete. Pearl Harbor was the moment Japan entered a war it could not win, because Japan's entire plan depended on a misunderstanding so deep it almost looks like arrogance wearing a uniform. Japan believed it could strike fast, seize a belt of territories, build a defensive perimeter so large it would feel impossible to crack, and then force Washington into negotiation. It believed Americans would calculate the cost and choose compromise. It believed the United States was a nation of comfort, not endurance. But Pearl Harbor didn't create caution. It created fury. It didn't create hesitation. It created a mission. And when the United States turns a war into a mission, history has a habit of bending. To see why Japan rolled the dice, you have to step back to the long fuse that led to the explosion. Japan, in the late 19th century, had modernized with ferocious speed. The Meiji transformation wasn't slow reform. It was a national sprint. Japan dismantled feudal structures, centralized authority, built industry, studied Western science, and created a modern army and navy. In a few decades, it became a power that could fight and win. It defeated China, humbled Russia, and proved it could compete in the imperial era. But that success produced a dangerous hunger, the belief that Japan deserved a seat at the highest table, not as a guest, but as an equal. And when the established powers treated Japan as lesser, when racism and imperial hierarchy blocked the recognition Japan thought it earned, the insult didn't fade. It hardened into ideology. Pride became policy. The problem was that power in the industrial age doesn't run on pride. It runs on raw material. And Japan's geography was not generous. The home islands did not contain the deep reservoirs of oil and minerals needed to fuel a modern empire. Japan could build ships and planes, but it could not easily feed them with fuel indefinitely. It imported the lifeblood of war. That meant Japan's strategic situation was always unstable, like a machine that runs brilliantly, as long as someone else keeps filling the tank. If those imports were cut off, Japan didn't just lose comfort. It lost oxygen. Meanwhile, the United States was expanding in the Pacific. Hawaii, Wake, Guam, Samoa, the Philippines. Each marker on the map was more than territory. It was a message of presence. It meant American shipping lanes, American bases, American eyes. And to Japan, it meant that the Pacific, where Japan wanted freedom of action, was increasingly shaped by American power. Japan's leaders watched the United States growing into a Pacific actor, and they didn't see a distant nation. They saw a gatekeeper. Then came China, the endless drain. In 1931, Japan seized Manchuria, establishing a foothold on the Asian mainland and creating a new border with the Soviet Union. In 1937, Japan launched a broader war in China, expecting a quick campaign, and instead falling into a grinding, costly struggle. The war consumed resources and hardened brutality. It became a vortex that demanded more men, more equipment, more fuel, more ships, more everything. The deeper Japan went, the harder it became to leave. Retreat would look like humiliation. Staying meant bleeding. So Japan looked for an answer that empires have always looked for when trapped: expansion. Inside Japanese strategic thinking, two paths competed. There was the northern path: push into Siberia, challenge the Soviet Union, seize minerals and potential oil. But that plan collided with reality in battles like Cock and Joel in 1939, where Soviet forces inflicted a harsh defeat on Japanese units and forced Tokyo to reconsider. The northern road looked less like opportunity and more like a meat grinder. The southern path, however, looked like a treasure chest with weak locks. Southeast Asia held oil in the Dutch East Indies, rubber and minerals in British territories, strategic bases across islands and straits. And in 1940 to 1941, with Europe tied down in crisis and colonial powers weakened, the Southern Plan felt like a once-in-a-century opening. But there was a knife between Japan and that treasure, the Philippines, an American-controlled archipelago sitting astride key routes, capable of threatening shipping lanes, capable of projecting air and naval power into the corridors Japan needed to survive. For Japanese planners, it created a brutal logic. If Japan moved south for resources, the United States could cut the line. If the United States cut the line, Japan's empire would starve. That is how war starts, not always from madness, but from the fear of suffocation combined with ambition. Washington, watching Japanese expansion, responded with economic pressure. Restrictions tightened. Exports of key materials were limited. And then the pressure hit the critical nerve, oil. Japan depended heavily on imported petroleum, and a large share came from the United States. When American policy moved toward freezing Japanese assets and restricting oil, Tokyo saw the countdown begin. Japan could not fight, occupy, and sustain an empire without fuel. If oil stopped, Japan's war machine would eventually stall. Every ship at sea, every aircraft sortie, every tank movement, every factory output, oil was the invisible foundation beneath all of it. Without oil, Japan's choices narrowed into a trap. Diplomacy continued, but it became a conversation of incompatible realities. The United States demanded that Japan step back from China and aggression. Japan's leadership, especially the militarists, viewed that as surrender of national destiny. You don't build an empire, suffer losses, and then walk away because your opponent asked politely. But the more Japan refused, the more Washington tightened. Japan's leaders faced two outcomes they both feared: accept American terms and lose face, or seize resources by force and risk war with a vastly larger industrial power. The fact that they chose the second tells you how deeply pride, fear, and momentum had fused. Imagine waking up on a Sunday morning, less an isolated event, feels almost more the climax of a strategic gamble. Japan's planners through the base like nothing in the world could possibly be urgent. That belief wasn't irrational. Without the United States had an horizon industrial base, vast resources, and capacity for mass production. Sirens, scale Japan could not match. Fire Japan's only path metal to tearing like paper in their minds. Men sprinting the short war, half-dressed, shocked the Americans wide. Paralyzed, still trying to understand whether they're dreaming. Just months, seconds to seize territory. Pearl Harbor stopped being fortified defenses, became a signal flare for negotiation before American industry could fully mobilize. Japan's strategy now wasn't built to defeat America in a marathon. Physical destruction. It was built to win the first few psychological rounds. Violation. Hope the opponent. It was the feeling that the United States, possible, protected by oceans, needed a blow that insulated by distance. Pearl Harbor was chosen because it was the center of American naval power once that happens. Once a nation feels distance itself punched in public like a shield, the American response stops being political behind and becomes Japan would prove Pearl Harbor is usually framed as the moment the United States entered World War II. Humiliate. That's true, they hope, but it's also shattered the sense of security. Pearl Harbor made Americans entered a war in Tokyo. Win. The attack was Japan's entire plan depended on a misunderstanding in Washington. So deep it would be framed looks like arrogance and wearing a uniform. The difference between those frames explains seize the after territories became inevitable. Build a defensive plan demanded so large it would feel impossible to crack. Scale never attempted to force Washington into negotiation. A carrier strike force. It believed Americans would calculate the cost. Sail under radio silence across the North Pacific. The United States moving like a nation of cold water, not endurance. The goal was to arrive unseen. Didn't create caution multiple ways. It created fury. Strike before American hesitation could understand what was happening. And when the United States military planned war into a mission choreography. History has a habit of bending were assigned roles to see why Japan rolled the dice. bombers to step back to the long torpedo planes that led to the explosion in shallow harbor waters. In the late 19th century, torpedoes themselves required modification, ferocious function, effectively. The Meiji transformation wasn't slow reform. The strike depended on timing, sprint, surprise. Japan dismantled fuel structure the first minute. Centralized authority on the American side, built industry. The tragedy was not that no one imagined created a modern army. The tragedy was that war was imagined elsewhere. It became a power. Many expected Japanese moves against Southeast Asia, humbled Russia, the Philippines, and proved it could be British and Imperial Dutch holdings. But that success produced this dangerous hunger, like an outpost, the belief that Japan deserved a seat at the highest table. A base can be heavily defended on paper, but as an equal, still be vulnerable when the established powers treated Japan is not just equipment. When racism and imperial hierarchy mindset was relaxed, Japan thought it earned Sunday. The insult didn't fade. It hardened into ideology. Somewhere on leave, pride became policy. The difference between routine was that power and industrial measured in minutes doesn't run on pride. When the first wave runs on raw material. The sky became and Japan's geography. Japanese aircraft appeared with the home islands that did not contain the deep reservoirs of oil and minerals. They targeted airfields first. A modern empire. That wasn't random. Japan could modern ships and planes, remove the enemy's ability to respond in the air, fuel indefinitely, and everything else becomes imported easier. The lifeblood of war. Planes on the ground that meant Japan's strategic situation was always unstable. Runways became like a machine burning metal. Runs brilliantly. The Americans were as long as someone else before they could raise their fists. If those in the harbor cut off became the main stage, didn't just lose comfort. Warships at lost oxygen, lined up. Meanwhile, targets. The United States torpedo bombers came low. Pacific. Skimming toward ships, releasing weapons designed to travel beneath the surface. Each marker on the map told more than territory. Bombs fell from above. It was a message of presence. Water filled with smoke. It meant American shipping lanes. Ships American that represented American eyes and power. And to Japan, symbols of safety. It meant that the Pacific suddenly looked fragile. Japan wanted freedom of action. To overstate was increasingly shaped by American power. When your strong leaders watched the United States growing into a Pacific actor, but disbelief. They didn't see a distant world they trusted as gone. They saw a gatekeeper in the middle of that. Then came another China. Truth appeared. The endless drain. Americans in 1931, Japan seized Manchuria. Anti-aircraft guns establishing a foothold. Damage control teams fought creating a new border with the Soviet individual Union. Acts of initiative sparked everywhere. Japan launched a someone gave a perfect order. Expecting a survival demanded it, and instead piling into a scrambled into the air cost the struggle. Almost no preparation. War consumed resources. Sailors hardened toward their stations. It became a vortex that demanded more men. Yes, more equipment, human reflex kicked in, more ships, and that reflex would scale up nationwide in weeks and months. The harder it became to leave. One of the most iconic disasters looked like humiliation was the explosion. Staying med aboard the USS Arizona. So Japan looked for an answer. Bomb penetrated and ignited ammunition stores and trapped. The ship erupted in a catastrophic blast. Japanese strategic killing a massive number of men in seconds. There was the psychological effect of such images into Siberia. Permanent. Challenge becomes national memory. Sees minerals becomes a symbol of innocence attacked. But that plan collided with reality and battles that demands response. And Joel. Pearl Harbor wasn't just a military blow. Soviet forces. It was a story the American public Japanese feel in their bones. Forced Tokyo. The second wave arrived and found the northern road looked less like anti-aircraft fire was more like a meat grinder. Confusion was still everywhere. However. But looked like a treasure no longer asleep. Weak locks. The chaos Southeast Asia held oil. Japan still inflicted damage. Rubber and minerals struck British territory. Still hurt American deep bases across islands and straits. The more the American system began to wake up, like a body tied down in crisis action, and colonial powers came a decision that would haunt the strategic story. Felt like a once-in-a-century opening. Japan did not launch a third wave. There was a knife between Japan storage and that treasure. Repair infrastructure. Philippines. That choice is American-controlled archipelagos sitting astride key routes, dry docks, capable of threatening shipping lanes. Those were the organs that could keep the Pacific Fleet alive and restore capabilities Japan needed to survive and recover Japanese dramatically. Leave them intact. Brutal logic, and the enemy heals faster south for resources. Japanese commanders feared lingering too long. If they feared American carriers might appear, Japan's empire would starve. They feared losing their own carriers, not always from madness, could not easily from fear of suffocation. So caution prevailed. Ambition. In the moment, Washington, it looked like prudence. Japanese expansion. In hindsight, responded. It looked like economic pressure to extend American paralysis. Exports of key materials were limited. Truly matters. Then the pressure already baked into critical Hawaii's timeline that morning. Japan depended American aircraft carriers, petroleum, not import, and a large share came from the United States. The defining instrument American policy moved toward freezing Japanese assets. Japan's own attack proved it. Tokyo saw the countdown begin. Demonstrated its ability fight to reshape naval warfare, and sustain an empire. The carriers that would become America's claws in the Pacific. Japan's war machine would not eventually stall. But every ship at sea Every
Pearl
aircraft
Harbor
sorted,
damaged
every
old
tank
power
movement,
more than new
every
power.
factory output,
And the new power
oil
would
was the
come back
invisible
with a
foundation
vengeance.
beneath all of
When
it.
the attack ended,
Without oil,
it didn't end
Japan's
psychologically.
choices narrowed
It
into
echoed.
a trap. It traveled.
Diplomacy continued.
It spread through radios,
it became
and
a conversation of incompatible realities.
and the kind of
The
national
United
silence
States
that
demanded
happens
that
when
Japan
people
step
realized
back
the
from
world
China
has shifted
and aggression.
The attack did what
Japan's
Japan
leadership,
wanted in one way,
especially the militarists,
ensured the United
viewed
States
that a
could
surrender
no
of
longer
national
stay out of the
destiny.
war.
You don't
but
build an
failed in
empire,
a way that
suffer
mattered.
losses. It did
and
not
then
convince
walk away
Americans to
because
negotiate.
your opponent asked
It convinced
politely.
them to mobilize.
But the more Japan
Franklin
refused,
Roosevelt's response
the more Washington
framed the event
tightened.
not as a complicated
Japan's leaders
geopolitical
faced
tragedy,
two outcomes they both
but
feared,
as a moral violation,
accept American terms,
an act
and
of
lose
treachery
face,
that demanded
or
unity.
seize resources
And that
by
framing
force
was
and
powerful
risk war
because it
with a
matched
vastly
what people
larger
felt.
industrial power.
Pearl Harbor
The fact
felt
that
like
they chose
betrayal.
the second
It
tells
felt
you
like a
how
sucker
deeply
punch.
pride.
It felt
fear,
like a country
and
being
momentum
attacked
had
while it
fused.
was sleeping. That emotion is combustible. It turns political differences into a single line. You are either for response, or you are against your own people. America's internal debate collapsed overnight. In the days that followed, the war widened. Japan's offensives surged across the Pacific. Territories fell. The empire expanded rapidly, just as Japanese planners had hoped. For a brief moment, the Pacific looked like a Japanese lake, and the defensive ring began to form. It was the high tide of Japanese expansion, the moment when the gamble seemed justified. But the same attack that gave Japan those months also gave the United States something it needed even more, a national reason to build, fight, and endure. Because once America entered the war, it didn't just enter as a participant. It entered as a machine. Industrial conversion accelerated. Production targets exploded. Shipbuilding became a national obsession. Training programs expanded. Logistics became an art. The United States began to do what it does when threatened, scale up until the numbers no longer look human. In an attritional industrial war, numbers are destiny. Japan understood that risk, which is why its plan depended on preventing the war from becoming attritional. But Pearl Harbor made an attritional war inevitable. Japan's strategic thinking now faced the brutal reality of its original limitation. It could win battles, yes. It had brilliant pilots, disciplined crews, and early war momentum, but its industrial capacity, its oil access, and its ability to replace losses were limited. A long war was a slow bleed. The more Japan expanded, the more it had to defend. The more it had to defend, the more its navy had to stretch across a massive perimeter. And a stretched perimeter is not a fortress. It's a set of thin walls waiting for the enemy to punch through. Pearl Harbor also forced the United States to rethink the nature of naval power. The old image of a decisive battleship clash began to fade as carrier warfare rose. The Pacific became a chessboard of air power, island bases, logistics hubs, and supply routes. America's response was not to chase immediate revenge blindly, but to build a strategy of steady pressure. The United States would advance, island by island, cutting Japanese supply lines, destroying the ability to reinforce, forcing Japan into a shrinking defensive shell. Japan wanted a short war of shock. The United States would give it a long war of strangulation. And this is where the story becomes almost poetic in its cruelty. Japan attacked because it feared being strangled by embargo and resource denial. Japan expanded south to seize oil and rubber. But the war it triggered turned into the ultimate strangulation. American submarines, aircraft, and blockade tactics would later choke Japan's shipping lanes, starving the empire of the very resources it had gone to war to seize. Pearl Harbor was the opening chapter of that trap. When people talk about Pearl Harbor, they often talk about it as a surprise attack that worked. And in the immediate sense, it did. But history doesn't care about immediate sense. History cares about trajectory. Pearl Harbor set a trajectory where Japan's odds worsened with each passing month. It created a unified American public, a moral narrative, an industrial mobilization, and a strategic commitment to total victory. It also dragged Germany and Italy into a wider war alignment, reshaping coalitions. And it made the United States not merely a supplier, but a primary actor. Now, if you want this script to truly fill a 50-minute video, we lean into what your transcriptions already do well: context, cause and effect, strategic logic, and vivid scene building. We add a deeper thread of tension,
through 3 arcs that keep the audience locked in without needing bullet points or chapter labels. The first arc is the slow tightening of the embargo noose and Japan's internal fear of suffocation. The second arc is the meticulous mechanics of the attack, planning, silence, the carrier fleet moving like a ghost. The third arc is the aftermath, the emotional explosion in the United States and the strategic consequences that made Pearl Harbor Japan's opening victory and eventual doom. So let's deepen the pre-attack tension further, because a great narration makes the audience feel like the disaster is inevitable even as characters still believe they can stop it. Picture Tokyo in 1941 as a room full of men staring at clocks. Every chart, every fuel estimate, every shipping report is a countdown. They're not thinking in decades. They're thinking in months. The oil reserves are finite. The war in China is draining. The United States is tightening pressure. The empire's future feels like it's narrowing into a single corridor. Seize the southern resources or accept humiliation. And humiliation, for a militarist ideology built on destiny and superiority, is not just politically unacceptable. It's existential. At the same time, picture Washington and Honolulu as 2 different mental universes. In Washington, intelligence officers are reading signals, seeing patterns, warning that war is coming. In Hawaii, the war feels distant, abstract, like a storm somewhere else in the ocean. Warning signs appear, radar readings, submarine sightings, fragmented signals. But in peacetime institutions, fragmented warnings often die in bureaucracy. And that's what makes Pearl Harbor such a case study in disaster. Not that no one suspected danger, but that the system could not assemble the danger into certainty fast enough. Now return to the carrier fleet itself. 6 carriers moving across the Pacific like a moving airfield. Thousands of crew, hundreds of planes, fuel consumption measured in massive figures, and absolute radio silence. Think about the discipline required. One mistake, one stray transmission, one chance encounter with a ship, and the entire surprise collapses. The entire operation was a gamble that the ocean would keep a secret. It did. On the morning of December 7th, the attack begins not with fireworks, but with method. Fighters detach to strafe airfields. Bombers line up on naval targets. Torpedo planes approach at low altitude, which is terrifying when you imagine the vulnerability. Slow, low, exposed to gunfire. Yet, they came anyway, because the first minutes mattered more than their own safety. Surprise is its own armor. In those first minutes, the Americans are not yet firing with full coordination, not yet fully awake, not yet able to form a coherent defense. Those minutes are where attackers win their best outcomes. As the harbor erupts, the scene becomes almost surreal. Ships listing, smoke pillars rising, oil burning on the water surface, men diving into water that is itself on fire. Meanwhile, in the background, ordinary civilian life is being ripped open. Families hear explosions. People run outside and look up and see aircraft with markings that should not be there. They hear machine guns. They smell smoke. The gap between Sunday morning and war zone collapses completely. And because America was not yet officially at war, the sense of disbelief is even sharper. It feels like being attacked before you're even allowed to mentally call it war. Then comes the question that lingers. Why did the Japanese not hit the fuel tanks? Why not destroy repair facilities? Why not attempt to finish the job completely? You can narrate that as a moment where prudence and fear beat boldness. Nagumo's task force was far from home. Carriers are precious. Lose them, and Japan's naval advantage evaporates. He had achieved surprise. He had inflicted heavy damage. He feared staying too long and being caught. That fear, completely understandable from a commander responsible for irreplaceable assets, was also the strategic hinge, because leaving too early meant leaving the enemy with the ability to recover. And then, the carrier's absence. This is where you can push drama without exaggeration, because it truly is one of history's cruel jokes. The weapons that would define naval war were not there to be destroyed. The battleships were burning, but the carriers survived. Japan had attacked the visible symbol of American naval power while leaving the future weapon intact. And it's hard to imagine a more perfect setup for the story that follows. A wounded America, humiliated, enraged, but still armed with the tools needed to strike back. After the attack, the mood in the United States shifts almost instantly, not in weeks, in hours. Pearl Harbor becomes a shared emotional fact. It doesn't matter where you lived or what your politics were. The country felt attacked. Roosevelt's speech crystallized that feeling into narrative. Congress declared war. Men enlisted. Factories shifted. Families accepted rationing. The war became personal. Japan expected negotiation. It got national mobilization. Japan's strategic gamble depended on an American weakness that didn't exist. Japan assumed Americans would not stomach a long, costly war across an ocean. But Pearl Harbor didn't discourage Americans. It offended them. It created a thirst not for defense, but for victory. And victory in that kind of war doesn't come from one heroic day. It comes from sustained, grinding pressure, logistics, production, training, replacement, adaptation. The very things Japan feared. In the months after Pearl Harbor, Japan surged. Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, Guam, Wake. An offensive wave that made the empire look unstoppable. But it was the high tide that comes before the retreat. Because the larger the perimeter, the more it becomes a target. Every island base becomes a node that can be isolated. Every convoy becomes vulnerable. Every ship sunk becomes harder to replace. The longer the war lasts, the more the industrial imbalance grows into destiny. Pearl Harbor was meant to buy Japan time. It did. But it also bought the United States clarity. Clarity that turned into resolve. Japan wanted a limited war that forced compromise. The United States fought an unlimited war that demanded surrender. Pearl Harbor, meant to protect Japan's empire, ensured that empire would eventually be dismantled piece by piece. Picture this. A calm Sunday morning that America never asked for. Then a sky that suddenly turns into a knife. One moment, Pearl Harbor is routine and sunlit. The next, it's a violent punctuation mark in history. A shock so loud it snaps the whole nation upright. Not because America was weak, but because it was caught mid-breath, mid-peace, mid-normal life. And in that instant, something flips. The United States stops being a country watching a world war from the ocean's edge and becomes a country that decides the war is coming to an end, on its terms. Before the bombs, the story is pressure. Japan was expanding across Asia, hungry for resources and status, building an empire on the logic that modern war runs on steel, oil, and shipping lanes. The U.S. looked at that expansion and saw a threat to the Pacific balance, to allies, to its own positions, and to the idea that conquest shouldn't be rewarded. So the relationship tightened into a vice, sanctions, embargoes, negotiations that sounded polite but felt like ultimatums. And for Japan's leadership, it started to feel like the clock was ticking louder than diplomacy. Japan's problem wasn't courage, it was math. It could strike hard, but it couldn't win a long industrial war against the United States. So the strategic dream became a gamble. Hit the U.S. Pacific Fleet hard enough, fast enough, to buy time. Time to seize territory, grab oil, build a defensive perimeter, and force Washington into a deal. The attack wasn't just military, it was psychological. The hope was that Americans, seeing the damage, would hesitate, that the shock would intimidate a democracy, that the pain would create doubt. That was the bet. And then the bet comes alive in the cold dark of the North Pacific, as a carrier force moves in silence. No radio chatter, no casual mistakes, just discipline, fuel, and intent. On the decks, pilots check straps and instruments with hands that know the difference between training and history. In Tokyo, the plan is elegant. A sudden blow, coordinated waves, torpedoes modified for shallow water, bombs aimed to cripple ships and aircraft. The whole thing is designed to feel like a door slammed shut, fast, loud, final. On Oahu, the American side doesn't feel like a battlefield yet. It feels like Sunday. Men are on leave, routines are loose. Defenses aren't braced for the worst-case scenario. There are warning signs, but warnings don't always become action when the mind refuses to accept a new reality. Even the idea of a carrier strike seems too bold, too distant, too unlikely. And that's what surprise feeds on. Not ignorance, but disbelief. A threat you can't emotionally imagine is a threat you don't fully prepare to meet. Then the first wave arrives, and the illusion evaporates. Aircraft sweep low, the first explosions bloom, and the base turns into a landscape of smoke and urgent movement. Airfields are hammered to keep American planes pinned, because any planes that take off become resistance, messy, unpredictable resistance, and the sound is everywhere. Engines, sirens, metal tearing, the crack of anti-aircraft fire waking up late, but waking up angry. In minutes, the day becomes a storm. The harbor becomes the focal point, because ships are power made visible. Battleships at anchor are giant symbols of a fleet's identity, and torpedoes are aimed to make those symbols bleed. Water erupts into tall columns, smoke rolls out like a curtain, and crews sprint into chaos that has no script. Some ships list, some burn, some will never move again. But the deeper damage isn't just steel. It's the shock of realizing the war has touched home soil, and it did it while the country was still half asleep. In the middle of the wreckage, you find moments that define a nation's reflex. Men grab guns they weren't assigned to. Crews fight fires in corridors choked with smoke. Pilots run to planes half ready, improvising fuel and ammo because ready is no longer a checklist, it's a survival instinct. The defense is uneven, messy, heroic in fragments, but it's there. And that matters, because it signals something the attackers didn't want to see. Americans are not freezing. They are reacting. They are learning, in real time. The second wave hits a base that is already on its feet. Anti-aircraft fire is thicker, coordination is improving, and the element of surprise is fading. The attackers still do damage, but the air is now hostile, filled with risk and consequence. Every minute the attack continues increases the chances of losing aircraft, losing elite pilots, losing the clean victory Japan needs to sell the illusion of control. And now a key decision hovers over the operation like a shadow. Whether to strike again, whether to push for fuel tanks and infrastructure, whether to gamble with unknown American carrier locations. When the Japanese force withdraws, the paradox becomes clear. Tactically, the strike is stunning. Strategically, it is incomplete. Some targets are devastated, but the beating heart of future naval power, the American carriers, are not there to be destroyed. The fuel reserves and repair infrastructure are not fully annihilated. And the harbor, because it is a harbor, becomes a workshop of recovery rather than a grave forever sealed. What looks like a knockout is, in hindsight, a punch that wakes the opponent into rage. That rage hits Washington almost immediately, not as confusion, but as unity. The emotional gravity of the attack compresses the political space. Arguments shrink, hesitation collapses, and the country rallies around a single conclusion. This wasn't just an attack on ships. It was an attack on the idea of safety, on the belief that distance was protection. When Roosevelt speaks, it isn't just a speech, it's a pivot. The United States steps into the war with a clarity that the attackers underestimated. And once the U.S. enters, the war changes shape. Democracies are slow to start sometimes, but when they commit, they can become machines of production and adaptation. America's factories don't just support the war, they reshape its scale. Shipyards build hulls like they're racing the calendar. Assembly lines turn resources into aircraft, trucks, ammunition, radios, everything a global war eats daily. The strategy becomes relentless. Not one dramatic moment, but a sustained pressure that squeezes an empire's ability to breathe. Japan's original concept depended on time and momentum. But time is exactly what Pearl Harbor ultimately steals from Japan, because the attack doesn't buy hesitation, it buys fury. The United States doesn't negotiate, it organizes. And while Japan spreads outward in the months that follow, grabbing territory quickly, the clock is already working against it. Every mile of empire becomes another mile of supply lines to defend, another port to secure, another convoy to protect. Expansion looks powerful until it becomes heavy. Meanwhile, the Pacific becomes a chessboard where carriers, submarines, and intelligence start writing the new rules. Battleships are still mighty, but air power is becoming the real fist. The war shifts from lines of anchored steel to moving airfields at sea. And the U.S., with its industrial capacity and ability to replace losses, is built for that kind of war. Japan has elite pilots and experience, but elite doesn't regenerate easily. When the attrition begins, skill becomes a resource that drains faster than oil. There's also a psychological reversal that Pearl Harbor triggers. The myth of the invulnerable rising empire breaks against the reality of American endurance. Japan hoped to shock a democracy into caution, but it shocked it into obsession. The U.S. public doesn't just want safety, it wants resolution. The war becomes personal in a way that fuels recruitment, savings drives, rationing, and a national willingness to sacrifice comfort for victory. That kind of social mobilization is a weapon as real as any torpedo. And then there's the irony that makes history sting. The attack that was supposed to protect Japan from a long war is one of the reasons the long war becomes inevitable. Because once the U.S. is fully engaged, the conflict stops being regional in effect. It becomes global in weight. The industrial output, the convoy systems, the alliance coordination, these are things Japan cannot match at scale. The strategy that required speed has created an opponent that thrives on duration. As months turn into years, Pearl Harbor isn't just remembered as destruction. It's remembered as ignition. It's the moment America's war identity hardens, less about being pulled into world events and more about shaping them. The Pacific Campaign becomes a grinding movement of islands, airfields, naval battles, and logistics, endless logistics. And every step forward is backed by a production base that can recover from losses, learn from errors, and come back stronger. So when you look back at Pearl Harbor, the most important detail isn't just what sank, it's what rose. The strike hit steel and killed lives, and that tragedy should never be minimized. But strategically, it also created something Japan could not control, a unified American will tied to an industrial engine. The attackers wanted to close a door. Instead, they opened a furnace. The shock did not end American participation. It began it. And that's why Pearl Harbor sits in history, like a warning and a trigger at the same time. It proves that surprise can win a morning, but it can also lose a war if it forges a stronger enemy. It proves that battles are not only decided by skill, but by what a nation becomes afterward, how it adapts, how it produces, how it endures. Japan gambled that America would flinch. America didn't flinch. America locked in. In the end, Pearl Harbor is the story of a strategic misread, mistaking shock for surrender, mistaking tactical success for psychological collapse, mistaking a democracy's initial distance for permanent hesitation. The attack was real. The damage was real. The grief was real. But so was the response. And once the United States decided the war would be finished, the outcome stopped being a question of if, and became a question of how long until the machinery of victory, once turned on, reaches full speed.